The bioluminescent corridors of the Harmony's Grace pulsed with a soft blue glow as Dr. Sarah Chen made her final preparations for what could either be humanity's greatest diplomatic triumph or its most spectacular failure. She stood before the mirror in her cramped quarters, adjusting the formal diplomatic robes that felt more like a costume than clothing, and tried to convince herself that 6 years of studying fragmented Vex-theory communications had actually prepared her for this moment. Dr. Chen to the bridge, the ship's AI announced with that particular tone reserved for announcements that were definitely not suggestions. We are approaching the rendezvous coordinates. Sarah took one last look at her reflection, noting the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent parsing alien syntax patterns, and headed for the door. The corridor outside buzzed with nervous energy as the diplomatic team made their final preparations, their voices carrying the particular strain that came with being the first humans to make contact with a galactic empire that could probably sterilize Earth without breaking stride. Ambassador Reynolds stood at the center of the bridge's main display, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour and his diplomatic bearing intact even in the face of what currently dominated the view screen. The Vex-theory bioship Sovereign's mandible hung in space like a living mountain, its organic hull pulsing with veins of bioluminescent energy that traced patterns across its surface. The vessel was easily 10 times the size of anything humanity had ever constructed, grown rather than built, and Sarah could see smaller ships moving around it like pilot fish attending a whale. Magnificent, isn't it? Reynolds said, though his voice carried an undertone of barely controlled anxiety. The xenobiologists estimate it's at least 3,000 years old, possibly older. The Vex-theory don't build ships so much as cultivate them. Sarah moved to the linguistics station and pulled up her cultural briefing files, though she could probably recite them in her sleep by now. The Vex-theory empire controlled over 200 star systems, had existed for millennia longer than human civilization, and operated under a rigid hierarchical structure that made ancient Earth monarchies look positively egalitarian. At the apex of this structure sat Queen Zexana, whose rule was absolute and whose displeasure could mean the extinction of entire species. Remember, Reynolds continued, addressing the entire diplomatic team, we prostrate ourselves immediately upon entering the throne chamber. No direct eye contact with the Queen under any circumstances. Speak only when spoken to, and for God's sake, don't make any sudden movements. The Vex-theory interpret aggressive body language as a challenge to their dominance hierarchy. Sarah nodded along with the rest of the team, though privately she wondered how anyone was supposed to conduct meaningful diplomacy while face down on the floor. Her role was primarily observational anyway, monitor the Queen's responses, watch for cultural cues that might not translate properly, and try to prevent any catastrophic misunderstandings that could lead to humanity becoming a footnote in galactic history. The docking procedure took nearly an hour, the Harmony's Grace being guided into what appeared to be a biological airlock that sealed around them with muscular contractions that Sarah found both fascinating and mildly disturbing. When they finally disembarked, they were met by an escort of Vex-theory warriors whose insectoid features were made even more imposing by their elaborate ceremonial armor. Sarah had studied countless images of the Vex-theory, but seeing them in person was an entirely different experience. They stood roughly human height but with a grace that spoke of perfect biological engineering, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming with an inner light that shifted color based on their emotional states. Most striking were the antenna-like projections that extended from where human ears would be, pointed and elegant, constantly moving to track sounds and chemical signals that human senses couldn't detect. The leader of their escort, identified by the golden patterns traced across her carapace, gestured for them to follow. I am Warkeeper Thexval. You will accompany me to the presence of our Queen. You will observe all protocols without deviation. Failure to do so will result in immediate termination of these proceedings. Charming, Sarah muttered under her breath, earning a sharp look from Ambassador Reynolds. The journey through the bioship was like walking through the digestive system of some vast creature, corridors that curved and pulsed with organic rhythms, walls that seemed to breathe, and lighting that shifted in response to their passage. Sarah found herself fascinated by the integration of technology and biology, noting how every surface seemed alive and purposeful. They passed through multiple security checkpoints, each more elaborate than the last, until finally arriving at massive doors that dilated open like an iris to reveal the throne chamber beyond. The space was vast, easily the size of a cathedral, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into bioluminescent mist above. And there, at the far end of the chamber, sat Queen Zexana on a throne that appeared to have grown from the ship's living hull. Sarah's first impression was of barely contained power. The queen was larger than the other Vextheri they had encountered, her exoskeleton traced with patterns of silver and gold that spoke of ancient authority. Her antenna-like ears stood alert and perfectly still, focused with predatory intensity on the approaching delegation. Most striking were her compound eyes, multifaceted gems that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom and ruthlessness of millennia. "Prostrate yourselves before the eternal queen," Warkeeper Thexval commanded. The diplomatic team dropped to their knees and then to their faces as rehearsed, but Sarah found herself hesitating. She had spent so many years studying Vextheri culture from fragments and guesswork, and here was the living embodiment of everything she had tried to understand. The queen's carapace was covered in bioluminescent patterns that shifted and flowed like living art, and Sarah realized she was witnessing a form of communication that no human had ever properly decoded. "You may speak," the queen's voice resonated through the chamber, though Sarah noticed the translation seemed to lag slightly behind the original clicking and chittering sounds. Ambassador Reynolds lifted his head slightly from his prostrate position. "Your Majesty, we come as representatives of humanity, seeking peaceful relations between our species and your great empire. We offer friendship, trade, and cultural exchange for mutual benefit." The queen's antenna ears twitched slightly, the first movement Sarah had seen her make since they entered the chamber. Humanity. The young species that screams across the void with primitive radio signals and builds crude metal ships. You seek audience with the Eternal Queen for what purpose? Sarah found herself studying the patterns of light that played across the queen's exoskeleton, trying to decode their meaning. There was something hypnotic about the way they flowed and shifted, and she realized she was becoming so absorbed in the observation that she had forgotten the protocol about eye contact. She looked up, directly into Queen Zexana's compound eyes. The effect was immediate and electric. The queen's entire body went rigid, her antenna ears snapping to full attention, and every other Vextheri in the chamber began making alarmed clicking sounds. Sarah realized her mistake a moment too late. Direct eye contact was considered a challenge to dominance, possibly an act of war. But instead of looking away, Sarah found herself trapped by the queen's gaze. Those compound eyes held depths she hadn't expected, intelligence that was alien yet somehow familiar, and something that might have been curiosity beneath the surface authority. Time seemed suspended as queen and human stared at each other across the vast throne chamber. Sarah could hear Ambassador Reynolds making desperate apologetic sounds, could sense the growing agitation of the Vextheri court, but all of that faded into background noise as she continued to meet the queen's gaze. And then, without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences, Sarah smiled. It was a gentle expression, the kind of warm, genuine smile she might offer to a nervous student or a frightened child. Nothing aggressive or challenging, just a simple human gesture of goodwill and reassurance. The reaction was unlike anything Sarah could have anticipated. Queen Zexana froze completely, her entire body going so still she might have been carved from stone. Her antenna ears, which had been tracking sounds throughout the chamber, swiveled to focus entirely on Sarah's face with laser-like intensity. The bioluminescent patterns on her carapace shifted to colors Sarah had never seen in any of her research, cycling through what appeared to be confusion, alarm, and something that might have been fascination. The silence in the throne chamber was deafening. Every Vextheri present had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped making any sound at all. Even Ambassador Reynolds had run out of apologetic words as he realized something unprecedented was happening. Queen Zexana slowly leaned forward on her throne, her compound eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of uncertainty that seemed entirely at odds with her regal bearing. What is that expression? What are you doing with your facial muscles?" Sarah felt a flutter of amusement at the clinical description of smiling, which only made her smile wider. "It's called smiling," Your Majesty. It's a human expression of friendliness and goodwill. Friendliness, the Queen repeated slowly, as if testing the translation. You bare your teeth as a gesture of friendliness? Not exactly baring teeth, Sarah said, trying to think of how to explain something so fundamentally human to someone who had never encountered the concept. It's more like showing pleasure at meeting someone. Indicating that you mean no harm and hope for positive interaction. The Queen's antenna ears twitched rapidly, a behavior that Warkeeper Thexval appeared to find deeply alarming. Your Majesty, the Warkeeper interjected, the alien clearly means to challenge your authority with this aggressive display. Permission to remove the threat? No, Queen Zexana said sharply, never taking her eyes off Sarah. I want to understand this, smiling. Human, stand. Sarah rose to her feet, acutely aware that every other member of the diplomatic team was still prostrate on the floor and probably considering her completely insane. But something in the Queen's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than hostility, and Sarah had spent too many years studying Vextheri culture to miss an opportunity for actual communication. Approach, the Queen commanded. Sarah walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber, until she stood at the base of the throne. Up close, Queen Zexana was even more impressive, her presence radiating an authority that was both alien and undeniably regal. But her antenna ears continued their rapid twitching, and Sarah was beginning to suspect that this was a sign of uncertainty rather than aggression. Show me this smiling again, the Queen demanded. Sarah smiled, trying to project the same warmth and friendliness as before. Like this, Your Majesty. It's just a way of showing that I'm pleased to meet you and hope we can be friends. Friends, the Queen repeated, her voice carrying the same uncertainty as before. This is another human concept. Yes, Your Majesty. It means choosing to care about someone's well-being, wanting good things for them, enjoying their company. Queen Zexana was quiet for a long moment, her compound eyes studying Sarah's face with scientific intensity. Finally, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful. We do not have this concept among the Vextheri. There is dominance and submission, strength and weakness, usefulness and disposal. But this, caring about another's well-being without expectation of return, this is unknown to us. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for a species that had achieved galactic dominance but had never discovered friendship. Would you like to learn about it, Your Majesty? The Queen's antenna ears snapped to full attention. You would teach the Eternal Queen. If Your Majesty is interested in learning, Sarah replied carefully, I would be honored to share what I know about human culture and customs. Another long silence filled the throne chamber. Sarah could hear Ambassador Reynolds making what sounded like praying sounds behind her, and she suspected she had just committed either the greatest diplomatic breakthrough or the most spectacular cultural disaster in human history. Finally, Queen Zexana spoke, her voice carrying a note of decision that seemed to surprise even her. Warkeeper Thexval, assign quarters to the human delegation. The one called Sarah will remain as my cultural liaison. I wish to study this smiling and these other human concepts more closely. Your Majesty, Thexval protested, surely it would be unwise to. Are you questioning my judgment, Warkeeper? The Queen's voice carried a dangerous edge, and her bioluminescent patterns shifted to warning colors. No, Your Majesty. It shall be as you command. As the diplomatic team was led away to their quarters, Sarah found herself alone with the most powerful being in the known galaxy, who was studying her face with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. This smiling, Queen Zexana said thoughtfully, it requires no physical strength, grants no tactical advantage, and serves no obvious survival purpose. Yet you employ it freely. Why? Sarah considered the question seriously. Because it makes life more pleasant, Your Majesty. It creates connections between people, reduces hostility, and sometimes it can turn enemies into friends. The Queen's antenna ears twitched again, that rapid motion that Sarah was beginning to recognize as deep thought. Show me this smiling once more, human Sarah. I wish to understand how such a simple expression could cause the eternal queen to hesitate. Sarah smiled again, putting all the warmth and genuine friendliness she could muster into the expression. And for the first time in her 3,000-year reign, Queen Zexana of the Vextheri Empire found herself wondering if there might be more to existence than conquest and dominance. In the depths of space, aboard a living ship older than human civilization, an alien queen learned to question everything she thought she knew about power, strength, and what it meant to rule. And it all began with a simple human smile. Sarah's new quarters aboard the Sovereign's Mandible were luxurious by human standards but felt more like a beautifully appointed prison cell when she considered that she was essentially being held under observation by an alien empire that could crush Earth like an insect. The walls pulsed with soft bioluminescence that shifted color according to some biological rhythm she couldn't fathom, and the furniture seemed to have grown from the ship's living hull rather than being manufactured. 3 days had passed since her unprecedented audience with Queen Zexana, and Sarah was beginning to understand that her new role as cultural liaison was less about diplomacy and more about serving as a fascinating specimen for the Queen's personal study. She had been summoned to the royal chambers 6 times already, each session consisting of the Queen asking increasingly detailed questions about human facial expressions while her antennae ears twitched with what Sarah was learning to recognize as intense concentration. The human Sarah is requested in the Queen's private study, announced the ship's organic communication system, which somehow managed to sound both melodious and vaguely threatening. Sarah had learned that refusing a royal summons wasn't really an option, though the Queen had been unfailingly polite in her scientific curiosity about human behavior. The journey to the royal quarters took her through sections of the bioship she hadn't seen before, past chambers that hummed with biological activity and corridors lined with what appeared to be living art. Vextheri crew members moved through the passages with fluid grace, their antennae ears tracking her progress with obvious curiosity. Word had apparently spread about the human who had made their queen hesitate, and Sarah found herself the subject of considerable attention. Queen Zexana's private study was a remarkable space that combined the formal authority of a throne room with the intimate atmosphere of a research laboratory. The walls were lined with specimens from across the galaxy, creatures preserved in biostasis fields that maintained them in perfect condition. At the center of the room sat the Queen herself, her massive form draped across what appeared to be a living chair that molded itself to her posture. "Ah, Sarah," the Queen said, her compound eyes tracking every nuance of Sarah's movement as she entered. "I have been considering our previous discussions about human emotional expression. I wish to conduct what you might call an experiment." Sarah had learned to be cautious about the Queen's experiments, which typically involved detailed analysis of her facial muscles while making various expressions. "What kind of experiment, Your Majesty?" "I have been studying recordings of human entertainment transmissions," Queen Zexana replied, gesturing toward a bioscreen that displayed frozen images from various Earth movies and television shows. "I observe that humans employ this smiling in many different contexts, but I cannot determine the subtle variations in meaning. Some appear aggressive, others submissive, some seem to indicate deception while others suggest genuine pleasure." Sarah looked at the screen, which was currently showing a freeze frame from what appeared to be a romantic comedy, a horror movie, and a political debate. "Those are very different types of smiles, Your Majesty. Context matters a great deal in human communication." The Queen's antennae ears perked up with obvious interest. "Demonstrate. Show me the difference between what you call a genuine smile and a deceptive one." Sarah found herself in the peculiar position of giving a master class in human facial expressions to a 3,000-year-old alien queen. She demonstrated a warm, genuine smile, then shifted to the kind of forced, artificial expression politicians use during uncomfortable photo opportunities. "Fascinating," Queen Zexana murmured, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that Sarah was beginning to associate with deep thought. "The muscle configuration is similar, but there are subtle differences around the optical sensors, the eyes, you call them. The genuine expression engages additional muscle groups." "Exactly, Your Majesty. Humans often say that real smiles reach the eyes. It's very difficult to fake genuine happiness completely. The queen leaned forward, her massive form suddenly seeming less regal and more like an eager student. And this, happiness. This is another emotional state that Vextheri do not experience. Sarah considered how to explain happiness to a species that operated purely on dominance hierarchies. Happiness is contentment, pleasure, satisfaction with one's current circumstances. It doesn't require defeating an enemy or achieving dominance over others. Sometimes it's as simple as enjoying a beautiful sunset or spending time with people you care about. People you care about, the queen repeated, her voice carrying that same note of puzzlement that appeared whenever they discussed human relationships. You mentioned this concept of friendship before. Explain it again, but in greater detail. Before Sarah could respond, the ship's communication system crackled to life with urgent alerts. All crew to combat stations. Unknown vessels approaching on attack vectors. Repeat, all crew to combat stations. Queen Zexana's demeanor changed instantly, her regal bearing shifting to something that was purely predatory. Her antennae snapped to full alert, and her bioluminescent patterns flared to aggressive warning colors. Warkeeper Thex Val, report. Your Majesty, came the reply through the organic communication system, we have 15 vessels of unknown configuration approaching at high speed. They are broadcasting challenge frequencies and demanding your surrender. The Queen's compound eyes flashed with what Sarah was learning to recognize as barely contained fury. Surrender? Someone dares demand the surrender of the Eternal Queen. Your Majesty, another voice interrupted, we're receiving identification signals. These are rebel Vextheri vessels, ships that have rejected imperial authority. Sarah watched as Queen Zexana's entire body went rigid with what appeared to be a mixture of rage and disbelief. Rebels. My own people dare to challenge me. Shall I escort the human to secure quarters? Warkeeper Thexval asked. No, the Queen said sharply, her gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was both alarming and strangely reassuring. She remains with me. I wish to observe how humans respond to combat situations. The journey to the command center took them through corridors that now pulsed with emergency lighting, bioluminescent patterns that shifted to urgent reds and golds as the ship's living systems prepared for battle. Sarah found herself struggling to keep up with Queen Zexana's pace, the alien monarch moving with a fluid grace that spoke of perfect biological engineering. The command center was a vast spherical chamber at the heart of the bioship, with the Queen's command throne suspended at the center while tactical displays flowed across the living walls around them. Vextheri officers moved with efficient precision, their antennae tracking multiple data streams as they coordinated the ship's defenses. Status report, Queen Zexana commanded as she settled into her throne, which immediately began interfacing with her nervous system through organic connections that emerged from its surface. 15 rebel vessels, Warkeeper Thexval reported. They're broadcasting propaganda about purifying the Empire from alien contamination and removing weak leadership that consorts with inferior species. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. They're talking about me, aren't they? My presence here is being used as evidence that you're unfit to rule. Queen Zexana's antennae twitched in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as agitation. The rebels have always opposed any contact with other species. They view it as contamination of Vextheri purity. Your presence here has apparently provided them with the excuse they needed to move against me. The tactical displays showed the approaching rebel fleet, their ships moving in attack formations that spoke of careful planning and coordination. Sarah watched as the Queen's forces maneuvered to meet them, but something in the alien monarch's posture suggested uncertainty. Your Majesty, Sarah said carefully, you keep looking at me instead of focusing on the battle. Why? Queen Zexana was quiet for a moment, her compound eyes tracking the tactical displays while her antennae maintained their focus on Sarah. I find myself curious about how humans would respond to this situation. Your species faces constant conflict, yet you speak of friendship and caring for others. How do you reconcile these contradictions? Sarah considered the question while weapons fire began to light up the space around them. We fight when we have to, Your Majesty, but we try to remember what we're fighting for. Not just dominance or territory, but to protect the people we care about and the values we believe in. Values, the Queen repeated thoughtfully. Another concept that translates poorly. Vex theory fight for survival, for dominance, for the continuation of our genetic lineage. But this idea of fighting for abstract principles. The ship shuddered as enemy fire struck their bioarmor, and Sarah watched the tactical displays show damage assessments in patterns of color that she was beginning to interpret. The rebels were pressing their attack with ruthless efficiency, and it was becoming clear that they had come prepared for a protracted battle. Your Majesty, one of the tactical officers reported, the rebels are demanding to speak with you directly. Put them through, Queen Zexana commanded. The main display shimmered and revealed the bridge of the lead rebel vessel, dominated by a Vex theory whose exoskeleton was marked with scars that spoke of countless battles. His antennae were held in an aggressive posture, and his bioluminescent patterns flashed with aggressive challenge colors. Zexana, the rebel leader said, deliberately omitting any honorific, you have violated the sacred principles of Vex theory purity by consorting with alien contamination. Surrender now, and we will grant you a warrior's death rather than the slow dissolution you deserve for this betrayal. Queen Zexana's response was a display of bioluminescent fury that made Sarah's eyes water. You dare challenge the Eternal Queen, Rexthol? You forget your place. My place is defending Vex theory purity from those too weak to maintain it, Rexthol replied. You have allowed alien influence to contaminate your judgment. The evidence stands beside your throne even now. All eyes turned to Sarah, who suddenly found herself the focal point of an interstellar political crisis. She looked around the command center at the assembled Vex theory officers, noting how many of their antennae were twitching with what might have been uncertainty. I am not contamination, Sarah said quietly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I'm just someone trying to understand a culture different from my own. Rexthol's compound eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. You speak, alien. You dare address Vex theory warriors. I dare address anyone who threatens people I've come to care about, Sarah replied, moving closer to Queen Zexana's throne. And yes, I care about her. That's not contamination, that's friendship. The effect of her words was immediate and electric. Queen Zexana's antennae snapped to full attention, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that Sarah had never seen before. Around the command center, officers exchanged glances of confusion and uncertainty. Friendship, Queen Zexana repeated slowly, her voice carrying a note of wonder. You would stand beside the throne during battle, for friendship. Yes, Your Majesty. Because that's what friends do. They stand together when things get difficult. Rexthol's image on the display flickered with static interference as his rage overloaded his ship's communication systems. This is exactly the contamination we came to eliminate. Alien concepts of weakness and sentimentality corrupting the purity of Vex theory strength. Queen Zexana slowly rose from her throne, her massive form radiating an authority that filled the command center. You call friendship weakness, Rexthol? Perhaps it is time you learned the difference between strength that stands alone and strength that stands together. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed, a three-dimensional dance of living ships and bioweapons that painted the void with patterns of destruction and beauty. But what struck her most was how Queen Zexana kept glancing at her during the tactical planning, as if seeking some kind of reassurance or guidance from the strange human who had introduced her to concepts her species had never known. As the first rebel ship fell to the combined fire of the royal fleet, Sarah realized that this battle was about more than political rebellion. It was about the fundamental question of whether an ancient civilization could learn to grow beyond its original limitations, or whether it would remain forever trapped in the patterns that had defined it for millennia. And at the center of it all sat an alien queen whose antennae twitched with new possibilities, while beside her stood a human who had accidentally taught her that sometimes the greatest strength came not from standing above others, but from choosing to stand beside them. The battle raged across 3 dimensions as the rebel fleet pressed their attack with calculated fury, their bioships weaving through space in patterns that spoke of intimate knowledge of royal fleet tactics. Sarah stood beside Queen Zexana's command throne, watching the tactical displays paint pictures of destruction across the curved walls while trying to understand how she had become the focal point of an alien civil war. "They know our standard defensive formations," Warkeeper Thexval reported, her antenna ears flickering with agitation as another royal vessel took critical damage. "Rex Thull was my predecessor before his exile. He trained half these officers." Queen Zexana's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with frustrated anger. "Then we must abandon standard tactics. Initiate random dispersal pattern Zex7. Sarah watched the tactical display shift as the royal fleet scattered into what appeared to be chaos, only to realize that there was an underlying mathematical pattern to their movements. "Your Majesty, may I ask a question about the battle?" The Queen's compound eyes fixed on her with laser intensity. "You have tactical knowledge, human Sarah?" "Not tactical knowledge exactly, but I've been studying the communication patterns between the rebel ships. They're using modified command frequencies, but the underlying syntax is still recognizable." "Meaning?" Sarah moved closer to the tactical display, pointing to the rebel formation patterns. "I can predict their next moves based on their communication protocols. They're about to attempt a pincer movement, targeting your flanking vessels while their heavy ships focus fire on the command center." Queen Zexana's antenna ears snapped to full attention. "You can decode their battle communications?" "The language structure is the same, just the encryption is different. And humans are very good at pattern recognition when it comes to language." For the first time since the battle began, something that might have been hope flickered across the Queen's bioluminescent patterns. "Warkeeper Thexval, route all intercepted rebel communications through the human station. If she can predict their movements." The next few minutes were a blur of linguistic analysis and tactical interpretation as Sarah worked to decode the rebel fleet's communication patterns. The Vextheri language was incredibly complex, with layers of meaning embedded in harmonic frequencies and chemical markers that human senses couldn't detect. But the underlying grammatical structure was something Sarah had spent years studying, and she found herself able to predict tactical shifts based on subtle changes in verb tenses and command modalities. "They're about to break formation and attempt individual ramming attacks," Sarah announced, her fingers flying across the alien interface as she parsed another burst of rebel communications. 3 ships will target the engines while the others provide covering fire." Queen Zexana's response was immediate, her biothrone interfacing directly with the ship's organic computer systems to relay defensive commands faster than conventional communication could achieve. The royal fleet shifted formation just as the rebel ships broke their attack pattern, turning what should have been a devastating assault into a costly mistake for the attackers. "Remarkable," the Queen murmured, her antenna ears twitching with what Sarah was learning to recognize as intense interest. "Your linguistic capabilities provide tactical advantages I had not anticipated." The battle continued for another hour, with Sarah serving as an early warning system for rebel tactics while Queen Zexana coordinated increasingly complex defensive maneuvers. But as the casualties mounted on both sides, Sarah began to notice something troubling about the Queen's behavior. "Your Majesty," she said during a brief lull in the fighting, "you keep looking at me instead of focusing completely on the battle." "Why?" Queen Zexana was quiet for a moment, her compound eyes reflecting the tactical display's constantly shifting lights. "I find myself uncertain about how to proceed. For 3,000 years, I have ruled through strength and dominance. But your presence here, your concepts of friendship and caring for others, they suggest alternatives I have never considered." Before Sarah could respond, the ship's organic communication system crackled with urgent alerts. "Hull breach in Section 7. Rebel boarding parties have penetrated the bioarmor." The command center erupted in coordinated activity as Vextheri officers deployed to repel the boarders, but Sarah noticed that Queen Zexana seemed frozen in indecision. The alien monarch's antenna ears were twitching rapidly, and her bioluminescent patterns cycled through colors that spoke of deep uncertainty. "Your Majesty," Warkeeper Thexval called, "do you wish me to coordinate the anti-boarding response?" "Yes," Queen Zexana replied, but her voice carried a note of distraction that was entirely unlike her usual commanding presence. Sarah moved closer to the throne, lowering her voice so only the queen could hear. "What's wrong? You seem paralyzed." "I am questioning everything," the queen admitted, her voice barely audible above the tactical alarms. "If your concepts of friendship and caring are valid, then perhaps these rebels are not enemies to be destroyed but subjects to be, what is the human word, rehabilitated." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. The queen's exposure to human concepts of morality and friendship was creating a crisis of confidence at the worst possible moment. "Your Majesty, sometimes caring about people means protecting them from those who would hurt them. Fighting doesn't always contradict friendship, sometimes it's necessary to preserve it." Another alert interrupted them. Emergency evacuation protocols initiated for all non-essential personnel. The human delegation is requested to report to evacuation pods immediately. Sarah looked toward the exit, then back at Queen Zexana, who was watching her with an intensity that felt almost physical. The right thing to do was follow evacuation procedures, get to safety, and let the Vextheri handle their own internal conflict. Instead, she moved closer to the command throne. "I'm staying." "What?" Queen Zexana's antennae ears snapped to full attention. "You must evacuate. You have no combat training, no biological armor, no defensive capabilities." "I have something else," Sarah replied, settling into a chair beside the throne. "I have a friend who needs support during a difficult time." The queen stared at her with an expression that was entirely alien yet somehow achingly familiar. "You would risk death for friendship." "That's what friends do, Your Majesty. We stand together when things get difficult." Queen Zexana's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that Sarah had never seen before, cycling through what appeared to be amazement, gratitude, and something that might have been the Vextheri equivalent of tears. "But I am not human. We are not the same species. By any logical analysis, you owe me nothing." "Logic doesn't have much to do with friendship," Sarah replied with a smile that felt strange in the middle of a space battle. "Besides, I'm curious to see how this turns out." The queen's antennae ears twitched in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as suppressed amusement. "You choose to face possible death out of curiosity. Curiosity and stubbornness. Very human traits." Their conversation was interrupted by Warkeeper Thexval's urgent report. "Your Majesty, the boarding parties have reached the medical bays. They're targeting wounded crew members." Sarah watched as Queen Zexana's entire demeanor shifted, her moment of uncertainty replaced by cold fury. "They attack the wounded? That violates every code of warrior honor." "Rexthol believes that mercy is weakness," Thexval replied grimly. "He's systematically eliminating anyone he considers contaminated by alien influence." Sarah felt her own anger rising at the thought of wounded beings targeted for execution. "Your Majesty, permission to go to the medical bays." "Absolutely not. You have no combat abilities." "I don't need combat abilities," Sarah replied, already moving toward the exit. "I have first aid training and knowledge of Vextheri anatomy from my cultural studies." "Your wounded need medical attention, not just protection." Queen Zexana's compound eyes tracked her movement with obvious alarm. "Sarah, you cannot simply walk into a combat zone." "Watch me," Sarah called back, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even her. The journey to the medical bays took her through corridors that pulsed with emergency lighting and echoed with the sounds of distant combat. Sarah encountered several Vextheri crew members along the way, their antennae ears twitching with confusion as they tried to understand why a human was moving toward danger instead of away from it. The medical bay itself was a scene of controlled chaos, with wounded Vextheri arranged on biobeds that monitored their life signs through organic sensors. Several medical technicians were working frantically to stabilize critical patients while security officers established defensive positions at the entrances. "Human." One of the technicians called out, her antennae ears flickering with surprise. "You should not be here." This area is not secure. I'm here to help, Sarah replied, moving toward the nearest wounded Vextheri. I have medical training and knowledge of your anatomy. Show me what needs to be done. What followed was perhaps the strangest hour of Sarah's life, as she found herself providing first aid to alien warriors while rebel forces attempted to break through the medical bay's defenses. The Vextheri medical staff initially viewed her presence with suspicion, but their attitude changed quickly as they witnessed her competent care for their wounded comrades. The human understands our physiology, one technician murmured to another. She knows which pressure points to avoid, how to stabilize damaged antennae ears. Sarah worked steadily through the wounded, noting how her presence seemed to have a calming effect on the injured Vextheri. Several of them had never seen a human before, and their compound eyes tracked her movements with curious fascination even through their pain. Why do you help us? One wounded warrior asked, his antennae ears drooping with exhaustion. We are not your people. Because you're hurt and I can help, Sarah replied simply, adjusting the biomonitor attached to his damaged carapace. That's reason enough. The wounded warrior's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that spoke of amazement. You risk yourself for strangers. This is unprecedented. Meanwhile, on the command deck, Queen Zexana was experiencing her own revelation as she watched security feeds of Sarah working in the medical bay. The sight of a human risking her life to care for wounded Vextheri was unlike anything in the Queen's 3,000 years of experience. She truly meant what she said about friendship, the Queen murmured, her antennae ears twitching with emotions she had no names for. She stands beside those who need help, regardless of species or benefit to herself. Warkeeper Thexval nodded grimly. The wounded speak of her with reverence, Your Majesty. They say she treats them as if they were her own clutchmates. Queen Zexana's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with decision. Then perhaps it is time I learned what true strength looks like. Thexval, I want you to do something unprecedented. Your Majesty. Grant the human access to the ship's neural network. Full integration. Thexval's antennae ears snapped back in shock. Your Majesty, that is forbidden. No non-Vextheri has ever been permitted neural interface with a bioship. The contamination risk. The only contamination I see, Queen Zexana replied, her voice carrying absolute authority, is the fear that prevents us from growing beyond our limitations. Sarah's different way of thinking might be exactly what we need to end this conflict. As the Queen's command was relayed to the medical bay, Sarah found herself facing a choice that would change the course of the battle and possibly the future of two civilizations. The organic neural interface that emerged from the medical bay's living walls represented either an unprecedented opportunity for cooperation or a dangerous step into unknown territory. This is highly irregular, the medical technician warned as biocables extended toward Sarah's nervous system. No human has ever interfaced with Vextheri organic technology. Sarah looked around the medical bay at the wounded warriors who had come to trust her, then up at the security monitor where she could see Queen Zexana watching from the command deck, her antennae ears twitching with what Sarah now recognized as hope mixed with fear. Irregular seems to be my specialty, Sarah replied, reaching for the neural interface. Let's see what happens when human and Vextheri minds work together. As the organic cables made contact with her nervous system, Sarah felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her human brain, merging with the vast living intelligence of the bioship itself. And in that moment of connection, she began to understand that the battle they were fighting was about more than military victory, it was about whether two very different forms of intelligence could learn to trust each other enough to create something entirely new. The neural interface felt like diving into an ocean of consciousness. Sarah's human awareness suddenly expanded beyond the familiar boundaries of her individual mind. The bioship's vast intelligence embraced her thoughts with curiosity rather than hostility, and she found herself experiencing the sovereign's mandible as a living entity with its own thoughts, fears, and desires. Most remarkably, she could sense Queen Zexana's consciousness at the center of it all, the monarch's mind serving as the primary control nexus for the entire vessel. Fascinating, came the Queen's mental voice, carrying harmonics that bypassed language entirely. Your thought patterns are unlike anything in our experience. So, chaotic, yet purposeful. How do you function with so many simultaneous emotional responses? Sarah tried to formulate a response and found that the neural link conveyed not just words but entire concepts wrapped in emotional context. We call it being human, Your Majesty. We feel everything at once and somehow make it work. Through the ship's sensory network, Sarah could perceive the ongoing battle with a clarity that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She felt the rebel boarding parties moving through the vessel's corridors like infections in a body, could sense the fear and determination of the royal forces defending against them, and most disturbing of all, could detect the cruel satisfaction radiating from Rex Thull's forces as they systematically eliminated anyone they considered contaminated by alien influence. They're not just fighting a military campaign, Sarah realized, her consciousness touching the edges of the rebels' tactical communications. They're conducting a purge. Anyone who showed interest in human culture, anyone who questioned traditional Vextheri isolation, anyone who represents change, they're all being targeted for elimination. Queen Zexana's mental presence flared with fury. Then they are not warriors. They are fanatics. And fanatics cannot be reasoned with, only stopped. Through the neural link, Sarah could feel the Queen beginning to coordinate a devastating counterattack, but something in the tactical patterns felt wrong. The strategy was based purely on overwhelming force, the traditional Vextheri approach of crushing opposition through superior strength. Your Majesty, wait, Sarah interjected. What if there's another way? Another way to what? They have made their choice, elimination of all contamination, including you and anyone who supports change. There can be no negotiation with such extremism. Sarah's consciousness drifted through the ship's neural network, touching the minds of crew members throughout the vessel. What she found there surprised her, not the monolithic warrior culture she had expected, but individuals with their own thoughts, fears, and growing curiosity about the human concepts their queen had been exploring. Look at your own people, Sarah suggested, sharing her perceptions through the neural link. They're already changing. The wounded in the medical bay talk about my care for them with wonder. The crew members who helped during the boarding speak of cooperation instead of dominance. The change isn't coming from outside contamination, it's growing from within. Queen Zexana's consciousness paused, her attention focusing on the crew members Sarah had identified. Through the neural link, they could both sense the subtle shifts in thinking that had been occurring throughout the ship, small but significant departures from traditional Vextheri patterns. You suggest that the rebels are already too late? That the contamination they fear has already spread? I suggest that what they call contamination, you might call evolution, Sarah replied. Your people are discovering that there are other ways to be strong besides domination. But if you defeat the rebels through pure force, you prove their point about alien influence making you weak. The Queen's mental presence was quiet for a long moment, her consciousness cycling through tactical options with the speed of thought. Then what do you propose? How does one defeat an enemy without proving their fundamental assumptions correct? Sarah's answer came not from strategic planning but from pure human intuition. We show them something they've never seen before. We defeat them with the very thing they claim is weakness. What followed was perhaps the strangest military operation in galactic history, as Sarah and Queen Zexana worked together through the neural link to coordinate a response based on cooperation rather than conquest. Instead of overwhelming the rebels with superior firepower, they began broadcasting something entirely unexpected, Sarah's smile. Through the ship's organic communication network, Sarah's facial expression was transmitted directly to the rebel vessels, appearing on their tactical displays with the same priority as critical battle information. The effect was immediate and profound, as rebel commanders found themselves staring at an alien expression they had no context for understanding. What is this? Rex Thull's voice crackled through the communication channels, his usual confidence replaced by confusion. What kind of psychological warfare weapon displays teeth in a non-aggressive manner? It's called friendship, Sarah replied through the neural link, her consciousness reaching across space to touch the minds of the rebel forces. It's what you're really afraid of, the possibility that strength doesn't have to mean standing alone. The rebel fleet's response was chaos. Some ships continued their attacks with increased fury, their commanders interpreting the smile as mockery. Others began to falter as their crews struggled to understand what they were experiencing. But most remarkably, several vessels simply stopped fighting altogether, their commanders too overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance to continue their assault. "Impossible," Rex Thul snarled through the communication link. "You cannot defeat warriors with alien facial expressions." "Watch me," Sarah replied, expanding her consciousness through the neural network to encompass not just the royal fleet but the rebel ships as well. The Vex-Theory bioships were all connected through quantum-entangled organic systems, and Sarah found that her human intuition could navigate these connections in ways that pure Vex-Theory logic could not. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists for centuries. Sarah's consciousness, amplified by the bioship's neural network and guided by Queen Zexana's tactical expertise, began to infiltrate the rebel fleet's own organic systems. But instead of attacking or sabotaging them, she simply shared what she had learned about friendship, cooperation, and caring for others. The rebel crews found themselves experiencing emotions they had no names for, concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength and survival. Sarah's memories of human cooperation, of people working together without dominance hierarchies, of individuals sacrificing for the good of others, flowed through the neural connections like a virus of compassion. "What are you doing to us?" Rex Thul demanded, his voice carrying a note of panic that was entirely unlike his usual aggressive confidence. "I'm showing you what you could be," Sarah replied gently. "Not weaker, not contaminated, just different. Better." The battle's end came not with explosions or surrender, but with something unprecedented in Vex-Theory history, rebellion forces simply choosing to stop fighting. One by one, rebel ships powered down their weapons and opened communication channels, their crews overwhelmed by concepts they were desperate to understand. "This is not victory through strength," Rex Thul protested in a final communication, his image on the display showing an alien commander whose worldview had been completely shattered. "This is defeat through contamination. This is evolution through cooperation," Queen Zexana replied, her consciousness radiating through the neural network with newfound confidence. "And it is the future of the Vex-Theory Empire." As the immediate crisis ended, Sarah found herself facing a new challenge, the political aftermath of having fundamentally altered an entire civilization's approach to conflict resolution. Through the neural link, she could sense the confusion and excitement of Vex-Theory throughout the fleet as they grappled with concepts their language had no words for. "What happens now?" she asked Queen Zexana through their mental connection. "Now we discover whether an empire built on dominance can learn to survive through cooperation," the Queen replied. "But first, we must deal with those who will never accept such change." The resolution came in the form of a formal challenge to Queen Zexana's rule, issued by the most conservative members of the royal court. Led by High Counselor Vexthek, a traditionalist whose antennae ears had remained rigidly still throughout the entire crisis, the challenge demanded that the Queen choose between her throne and her contamination by human influence. The confrontation took place in the Great Assembly Hall, with representatives from across the empire gathered to witness what many believed would be the end of Queen Zexana's 3,000-year reign. Sarah stood beside the throne, no longer as a prisoner or curiosity but as something unprecedented in Vex-Theory history, a trusted advisor from another species. "Eternal Queen," High Counselor Vexthek announced, his voice carrying the formal authority of ancient tradition, "you stand accused of allowing alien contamination to corrupt your judgment and weaken the empire. Choose now, your throne or your association with human influence." Queen Zexana rose from her throne with the fluid grace that marked her species, her massive form radiating an authority that filled the vast chamber. But when she spoke, her voice carried something that had never been heard in a formal Vex-Theory court: warmth. "High Counselor, you ask me to choose between my throne and the greatest discovery of my reign. You ask me to choose between the old ways and the possibility of something better. You ask me to choose between strength through isolation and strength through cooperation. The queen's antenna ears, which had been twitching almost constantly since her first encounter with Sarah, suddenly went completely still. "I choose neither. Your Majesty." Vexthek's confusion was evident in the rapid flickering of his bioluminescent patterns. Queen Zexana turned to Sarah, her compound eyes reflecting depths of emotion that transcended species barriers. "Human Sarah, you have taught me that sometimes the most powerful response to an impossible choice is to refuse to accept the limitations that created it." And then, for the first time in the 3,000-year history of the Vextheri Empire, an alien queen smiled. The expression was imperfect, alien features attempting to replicate a purely human gesture. But the intent was unmistakable, and the effect was electric. Throughout the assembly hall, Vextheri nobles and courtiers stared in stunned silence as their monarch displayed an emotion they had no context for understanding. "This is the contamination you fear," Queen Zexana announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "The ability to express joy, to show care for others, to find strength in cooperation rather than domination. If this is weakness, then I choose to be weak. If this is contamination, then let it spread throughout the empire." High Counselor Vexthek's antenna ears snapped to full attention. "Your Majesty, you cannot simply abandon millennia of tradition." "I am not abandoning anything," the Queen replied, her smile growing wider as she learned to manipulate the unfamiliar facial muscles. "I am adding to it. The Vextheri will remain strong, but we will no longer confuse strength with isolation. We will no longer mistake cooperation for weakness." The debate that followed lasted for hours, with traditionalists arguing for the preservation of pure Vextheri culture while progressives advocated for the integration of human concepts into their society. But the real decision had already been made the moment Queen Zexana chose to smile, demonstrating that change was not contamination but growth. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed human embassy within the Vextheri capital, watching ships from dozens of species dock at the expanded port facilities. The Empire had not just opened its borders to humanity but had become a beacon for interspecies cooperation throughout the galaxy. The quarterly reports indicate that trade efficiency has increased by 300% since we implemented cooperative protocols, Queen Zexana reported, settling beside Sarah with the comfortable ease of friendship. The alien monarch had learned to smile regularly, though her antenna ears still twitched with amusement whenever she caught her reflection displaying the expression. More importantly, Sarah replied, violent conflicts within the Empire have decreased by 90%. It turns out that when people feel valued and heard, they're less likely to rebel. Through the viewport, they could see Rex Thol's ship approaching the docking bay. The former rebel leader had become one of the most effective advocates for the new cooperative approach, his military expertise proving invaluable in developing nonviolent conflict resolution protocols. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Giving up the old ways, accepting change." Queen Zexana's antenna ears twitched with what Sarah now recognized as contentment. "How can I regret discovering friendship? How can I regret learning that true strength comes not from standing above others but from helping them stand beside you?" As the twin moons of the Vextheri homeworld rose over the capital city, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A simple smile, offered at the right moment to the right person, had fundamentally altered the course of galactic civilization. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons were not technological or military but deeply, fundamentally human. "Your Majesty," Sarah said, turning to her friend with a grin that had become as natural as breathing, ready for tomorrow's cultural exchange conference. Queen Zexana's response was a smile that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, warm, genuine, and filled with the kind of joy that could only come from discovering that the universe was far more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. Behind them, the Vextheri Empire continued its transformation from isolated dominance to cooperative strength, proving that even the most ancient civilizations could learn to grow. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that Sarah had known from the beginning: sometimes the greatest victory was not in defeating your enemies but in helping them discover that they didn't need to be enemies at all.